to me, there was that moment where Bruce realized he can't punch into the darkness. He has to be the hand to lead people out.
How's it going, folks? Patrick Stewart, thank you so much for tuning back into my channel. I've got a special treat tonight. I interviewed him once, Trevor Fernandes-Lenkiewicz, the CEO of Pocketwatch Press, creator, founder, comic book genius. Well, anyway, I went to see the Batman. He's seen it twice, and I'm a movie buff guy. I'm new to comics. I don't know anything about comics. Trevor is the comic master. And he reached out to me and said, why don't we discuss Batman? Spoiler alert, there's going to be tons of spoilers. So if you have not seen the Batman, check out now. But without further ado, I'm going to bring Trevor into this thing now. Trevor, how's it going, brother?
Oh man, it's good, man. It's good. I got a good Batman movie to talk about.
Well,
spirits are high, brother.
Before we get into the Batman movie, some congratulations are in order because, my friend, didn't you just get out of a Kickstarter number 4?
Yeah. Thanks to your support, a couple of your viewers' supports like Christian Burke and Mark McKeever and John Mapp. Yeah,
Jason Mapp. Jason. So
Jason
my two
Mapp.
friends are John and Jason, but yeah,
that's it. That's it. But yeah, thanks to folks like these fine gentlemen and many more. We finished off our most successful Kickstarter to date with about 150 people pre-ordering via Kickstarter and $8,500 going towards the production of the printing of issue 4 and the art production of issue 5. So it's really an optimistic time for us here at Pocketwatch Press. By us, I mean me. Because I am, as you said, a kind of everything, including the janitor, which is like my least favorite part of the job. But so we're onward and upward next week, or I guess I don't know when this will air necessarily, but the weekend of March 18th, I'll be at Toronto Comic-Con in Toronto, Canada. No, I'm not Canadian. I'm not nearly nice enough, but I will be in Toronto for that show. So onward and upward, gentlemen, onward and upward.
Now, quick question before we get into this awesome movie, and I'm assuming you think it's awesome, at least I hope so. Can people still purchase the comics, or is the Kickstarter done?
Yes. Yeah. So you won't necessarily receive the same benefits like the free signature or the access to certain products, but you can check out any issue of Area 51, the Helix Project, at darkknightnation.com/shop. I'm sure I'll throw you a link to throw in the description by the time this airs. But I will soon be putting up pre-orders for issue 4. The only bummer for those of you that are looking to do it after the fact is that the secret variant, the Smile variant, will not be made available on the website because it is a Kickstarter and convention exclusive. So hopefully that will reinstill within folks to get down with us all the way on the ground, so that when we rise, you come with us. But issues 1 through 4 will be made available as I speak. Currently 1 through 3 are, and I will be putting up a pre-order form for issue 4 very, very shortly. So,
well, man, brother, again, congratulations. I'm so excited for you. And just remember, guys,
thanks.
A few years from now, when you're seeing this guy's name like everywhere in comics, I knew him. I knew him. All right, so the Batman. I don't have much to say other than I've always liked the character. Something about the character speaks to me as far as he's not a superhero in the sense that he has superpowers. He's a superhero because he chooses to be, and the guy's knucking futz. I mean, let's call it. I mean, the guy's he's hitched in the head. But I've always loved the character. I used to watch the TV series in the 80s, with the silk pajamas.
Museum officials could have heard about the Joker's prison break and hastily included him.
Sure.
That was my introduction to Batman, and then of course, as I got older, we had the Michael Keaton movies.
I'm Batman.
Which I thought were great, and nobody could ever do a better job. And then Christian Bale came in and was like, okay, yeah, somebody can do a better job.
I'm Batman.
And then Ben Affleck, whose portrayal I enjoyed, actually. And everyone was like, oh, nobody could do a better job than Christian Bale. And then Robert Pattinson's, everyone was like, nobody can do a better job. And it's just like, it keeps getting better and better for me. But I'm coming from a standpoint of just, I like movies. And I absolutely, When I say I loved The Batman, for those of you that know me, my favorite movie of all time is The Crow. I love it, which ironically enough, and I'll put the poster up here, the original poster of The Crow before they settled on the final font, it was billed as darker than the Bat. They were comparing it specifically to Batman. And this movie, The Batman, nearly, it didn't, but nearly supplanted The Crow as my favorite movie of all time.
Wow.
It's an experience that we'll get into here in a bit. I'm still trying to find words to... I've never experienced anything like this on the big screen, ever. Matt Reeves did something different, and you can probably break this down better. But I mean, you're the comic guy, so this character for you, I mean, you could pick this thing apart piece by piece by piece. But I did feel like there were several scenes where if I could have just paused it on the big screen, I'm going to pull a phrase out that that you gave me when we did our interview for your Kickstarter, which was comics are a medium that can do things movies can't, where they can take one moment and stretch it into infinity. And I felt like there were moments in the movie like that it was like I'm almost inside of a comic book here in my hands, and I'm soaking in the emotions and the feeling and the point of view, and I'm being taken on this emotional roller coaster just in a few heartbeats, and it felt like it was just paused, like I was set to soak in it, but not in a drawn out the movie in a boring kind of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, despite having a 3-hour runtime, I personally didn't feel a minute of it because I think that I was immersed the whole way through, you know, and I think one of the reasons why you feel that way about this movie and being able to really hang on certain moments are because they really take the time to flesh out very unique characteristics or mannerisms. You know, just for example, taking 30 seconds to watch Selina Kyle break her way into that vault, you know, before she first meets Batman, as opposed to 10 seconds.
You're pretty good at that.
You know, taking the time to watch her execute her craft and looking at how she behaves in that scenario, it's going to tell you a lot more about that character, whether you're able to voice it or not, right? You're going to be able to kind of put your your hand around a little bit more of her expertise and her approach, which I think is great. And it was handled well. Under a lesser director, under a lesser cast, those moments would have felt drawn out, but they felt so necessary. And it all sort of contributed to making this world and these characters feel like they've existed long before we've seen them on the screen. And I think that's really important in a film like this that takes place in year 2 of Batman's career, because we don't really, you know, we're not going to overblow the death of the Waynes or Batman putting on the cowl for the first time, right? So this world has to feel established, and man, it absolutely does. And I mean, it's wild to hear that this might be your favorite movie of all time. Because for me, like, it's my favorite Batman movie of all time. And that's high praise, man, because The Dark Knight is the only comic book movie to break it into my top 10 favorite movies of all time. Okay. And this beat out The Dark Knight. So it's a top 10 movie of all time for me. You know, if I were to sort of summarize it for those of you that haven't seen it, to me, I think the Dark Knight might have higher highs, right? Like, Dark Knight has moments that are absolute 10 out of 10s, but it also has moments that are like 7 out of 10s. This movie like consistently runs between like a 9 and a 9.5. The floor for this movie is stupendously high, and you're enjoying the ride all the way through. And the beautiful thing is, as opposed to like the Nolan movies, it doesn't spoon feed you all of the thematic elements of the film, right? Like, we don't need to go over the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne, but there's a moment when Bruce is investigating a crime scene where he just stops and obsessively stares at a little boy that just lost his parents, because he's recognizing that same trauma and it's affecting him, and it's totally wordless. It's just a moment of great performance by Robert Pattinson and great camera by Greg Fraser and Matt Reeves. That's what visual storytelling should do. And again, we get that moment of almost complete silence, except for this sort of robotic clicking of the forensics cameras, you know, taking photos of the scenes, or the clicking of boots. There's this isolative element and this moment where you can feel Bruce as a human being connecting to this boy through trauma. And the whole time, like, nobody had to tell it to us. We didn't need an offhand line where somebody, makes a joke about how it looks familiar or whatever. That's great storytelling. And it's in those nuanced moments that I think, amongst many, that this film really does shine. I think Robert Pattinson is the best Batman we've ever had. I know a lot of people had a lot of complaints prior to the movie actually releasing about his size, and despite his size, he's the most menacing Batman we've ever had.
You're not kidding.
I've never been more convinced that a Batman could beat the shit out of me more until right now, and I'm pretty sure I'm heavier than Robert Pattinson.
I'm vengeance.
So that says something. There's a presence that they provide, and an atmosphere that Robert Pattinson, when he dons that suit, that he brings to the table. That again is just like a compliment to how well Pattinson's performance works in tandem with the costume designer and with Michael Giacchino's score and with Greg Fraser's cinematography and with Matt Reeves' direction. There's just a symbiosis in this movie that is so hard to compete with. Like, not just for a Batman movie, for any other movie. Like, this year would have to be so stupendously stacked for me to feel like the Batman doesn't deserve an Oscar nod for Best Picture.
Yeah, it's just the synergy of all the elements. You said, like, the visuals, and well, I'm going to bring in the music, the soundtrack and the score, particularly the score. But it's like, I didn't realize until watching some analysis of it later on, but like how close the entry of Robert Pattinson's Batman onto the scene, where we find out he's vengeance, that it sounds almost like Darth Vader's march, and it wasn't accidental. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's like you said it, like, this dude could kick my butt. Like, I'd almost rather face off with Darth Vader. And I mean, this dude is scary. But I mean, I'm a huge Nirvana fan, so I mean that just hit me hard. The whole extra secret track from "Smells Like Teen Spirit." Something in the way.
Something in the way.
Underneath the bridge, top is sprung a leak.
Love it, absolutely love it. One of the easiest songs to ever play on the guitar. Just 2 chords.
And you gotta appreciate the execution of that track, because they use it twice. They use it in the beginning of the film when you get this really great monologue from Bruce about the state of Gotham City, and it also sort of reveals a lot about his mental and emotional state up until that point. And then at the end of the film, right after the climax of the movie, you get it again. But they're executed very, very differently. The second time you get it, behind it is this beautiful orchestrated build, where Michael Giacchino and the orchestra behind him help to add, and they change the way they're framing that song, right? It goes from this sort of hurt, emotionally dour tune to this triumph, right, of the human spirit and of will, and of justice, ultimately, right, in this film. So again, man, you want to talk about how well this movie just sort of works, and how all of the cogs in this machine are so well oiled. That is a great example of it, man, in the way that they use that song so well.
It amazes me in a movie where I love action so much, and I mean, like the scene with the bullets bouncing off him in the hallway. I mean, that was just genius. But in a movie that, I mean, is violent, is action packed, full of mystery and intrigue and just everything over the top. The scene that I'm going to pull out, if I could say just one scene, just like, it's like I'm watching something masterfully put together that just grabbed my soul and pulled me in, was when Bruce Wayne, Robert Pattinson, walks in. No cowl, no cape, no bat, no nothing. Just walks into Falcone's lair. And they have this moment where Mob Boss is talking to the kid and basically kind of finishing his upbringing and saying it's time for the boy to become a man. And you see this whole just this crushing of every delusion he's ever hung on to by this man. And I mean, just like these scenes where they're talking very close to each other. And for me, because I just now started picking up comics, it's like I was watching these frames turn where it's like the frame gets bigger and the scene gets tighter, and like there's partial face to a partial face. It just, to me, I was just like, what's happening here? And I felt my entire world rock in this whole, you have this expectation of what's going to happen, and it subverted all expectations. And that scene to me is when I already was totally enjoying the movie, but that's when it hooked me, and it's like, I'm bought in. I'm here for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was there from the jump, man. Like, there's a moment, actually. So, again, when we talk about like duality and the sort of repetition of a strategy from the beginning of the movie, using it to conclude the film, Bruce gives a monologue at the beginning of the film and at the end of the film, and Bruce's monologue, like, it could have been horrible. Like, by all means, most filmmakers that include monologues tend to do their movie a disservice, right? Like in the theatrical version of Blade Runner, there's that weird Harrison Ford monologue that kind of ruins everything, and then you watch the final cut and you're like, great, I didn't need that. It plays a lot of narrative and like atmospheric function, man, and it does something that this movie does throughout the course of its story, and it pays beautiful homage to the source material that came before it. The monologue is so Frank Miller year one Batman, it's not even funny. Like, all I did when I thought about that monologue kind of playing over as Bruce, you watch him integrating himself amongst the quote unquote nocturnal animals of Gotham, and he's driving through the city. All I could think about was Batman year one in that moment. And there are so many great little sort of spiritual homages in the way this movie is handled, that call back to some of the greatest Batman stories of all time. Like, this movie really bridges the gap for me. Like, it is a fantastic noir, gritty, like detective noir thriller, but it's also super loyal to the comic books, and it merges those things together. Like, when I watch this movie, I think about Batman Year One and The Long Halloween and Court of the Owl Year and Ego by Dark. Like, but also I look at this movie and I'm like, this is also something entirely separate. Like, it's Matt Reeves' vision of the Batman, and it bridges that gap really, really well. Man. It's just as a comic book fan, as a fan of cinema, I don't think I could have asked for a better execution in that way, because it's loyal to itself, but it is also, beloved spiritually of all of the great stories that have sort of predicated it and developed this character into the icon and mythological figure for all intents and purposes, that it has come to be.
I appreciated the dark humor, like with Thumb Drive. That I was.
It's funny because I read into a lot of reviews, and there are a lot of criticisms about how this movie is dark, which it is, but also I felt like the comedic timing was impeccable. Like, it just knew Matt Reeves just knew when in the script we needed a break from all of the darkness, and like the like buddy cop chemistry between Jeffrey Wright and Robert Pattinson's Batman were incredible. Like,
interrogating Penguin,
they don't get
right.
And Penguin, like, they don't get a ridiculous amount of screen time together, but everything they get is noticeable, and it not only helps to propel the plot of the film, but also, like, we're getting some great character here. Like, we're seeing to a lesser extent, we're seeing Bruce be able to kind of let his guard down a little bit more, because this is the one person in Gotham that he trusts. Yeah. I mean, I think Jeffrey Wright just plays Gordon in such an approachable way, where you understand, yes, he's a competent detective, a competent police lieutenant, but also, like, there is that human aspect, that necessity for him to kind of create comedy as a sort of compulsive way to circumvent, like, how dark and disgusting this world is. It's great. Like, it's so great in that way. And that's something I think is also worth bringing up is just the general chemistry amongst the cast. I mean, whether it's Pattinson and Selena Kyle, or Zoe Kravitz and Falcone, and the way they call back to Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale's When in Rome story. Like, there's just I don't really like I look at this movie, and sure, like there might be some small nitpicks that I could pull out, but it kind of fundamentally works on every level, and the chemistry between the cast and their performances is a foundational part of that. Like, I mean, you feel like all of these relationships, whether they're built in this movie or they existed prior to, they feel so beyond believable and immersive. That deserves a lot of credit, because particularly in like big blockbuster films, or in this new sort of, the last decade and some change of comic book movies, sometimes some of these relationships feel like they're just like pins in a board, and they're just stuck there. But there's something about this film that was just, it feels established. Everything about this movie felt established.
One of the minor nitpicks I have, actually, it was one of the, I dismissed it while I was watching the scene, and it was okay. I was okay with the. I mean, it's me nitpicking. Tomato, something like that. Like, it really doesn't even matter. The nitpick doesn't count. It's just me trying to find something to nitpick. It was when Alfred wakes up in the hospital, and Bruce doesn't waste any time. Here's this man who almost died. He wakes up. He hadn't been awake for 2 seconds. It's like, let me start interrogating Alfred. Like, I'm gonna come out and accuse you of, doing me wrong and lying to me. And it's like, can you at least let the man wake up? It's like, we had all these scenes drawn out, and we get the extra time and zooming in on this and that, but we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off and get right into just having it out with Alfred. And but I let the nitpick go, because all I could think about actually was you in that scene, because we left off when we talked last, where I was asking if you could write any comic. You were telling me about you've got a whole outline for Batman, and how you want to explore the relationship of Alfred as the father figure. And man, am I wrong, or did that come out in this movie?
Yeah, I mean, we don't get a lot about their relationship, but what we do get, I think, was really significant. And I thought it made a lot of sense for Bruce to sort of immediately go on the offensive, because I viewed the dynamic between, Batman and Bruce Wayne in this film as Bruce Wayne sort of being the oxygen that the flame of Batman sort of requires to function, because it is all consuming. He is full-time Batman for all intents and purposes, and kind of neglects, for the most part, his own sense of self beyond the mission, which you get a sense that by the end of this movie he begins to recognize that his obsession will kind of lead him to a narrow-mindedness. But I think that all sort of contributes to the fact that, like, his first instinct was to sort of attack Alfred and to poke him and to be the detective and to figure things out. And over the course of that interaction, you can see, despite the sort of limited expressionism, because I think Robert Pattinson very purposefully played a very reserved Bruce Wayne, but you can see through, like, how uncomfortable he was in his mannerisms, like twitches in his eyebrow or in his embouchure, that he felt really uncomfortable by what he was doing. And you see him in, as Alfred begins to apologize, he goes, "Alfred, don't apologize," despite having, like, just attacked him. And I think under, again, a lesser cast and a lesser director and a lesser writer, that moment might have come off as a little bit lopsided. But to me, I think everything was there, because it tells me that his first instinct, again, was to be that detective and to get down to the solution. And once he begins to sort of confront the error of that approach with his quote-unquote surrogate father, like, you can see how uncomfortable it makes him, and he just kind of stops, and you get the sort of very beautiful silent moment between the two of them that they share before eventually duty calls. But yeah, I really liked that moment.
I like how it showed Alfred was cooperative in, still lecturing, but cooperative in the investigation, trying to help with ciphers. But something I was going to ask you, because I haven't studied every iteration of Batman that's out there, but there was a phrase that Alfred said to Bruce in there in the hospital. He says, I taught you to fight, or I could teach you to fight, and I was like, did Alfred help train Bruce? Because Bruce has got to pick these skills up somewhere. You know, in Batman Begins, he goes off for ninja training. And I'm like, okay, so where did he
Yeah.
pick these skills up? And to me, it seems like it's insinuated that he got them from Alfred.
So yeah, there are several interpretations of Batman where, as a child, before he goes off to travel, that he begins to learn basic fighting skills, boxing, guerrilla warfare from Alfred, because in numerous iterations prior to being a butler for the Waynes, or I think in the case of this film and like Batman Earth One, he was Thomas and Martha Wayne's bodyguard. Only to then assume the sort of butler guardian role of Bruce Wayne afterward. He was in the Royal Navy in England, and in cases they go even further to say that Alfred was a member of MI6, which essentially means he's like James Bond, essentially. So it all changes. In my head canon, I've always had it that before Alfred sends Bruce off to travel, he's like, I'm going to teach you how to take care of yourself before you go, be an idiot and get yourself killed. I feel like this Bruce Wayne felt like he was too well traveled to have just learned exclusively from Alfred, particularly in that scene actually where he talks about having mastered his fears. Like he talks about it in this very sort of Eastern sort of ethological perspective where, Bruce spent a lot of time out in Asia and in Eastern countries learning about meditation and mastering yourself. So again, I could be reading too much into it. But yeah, I mean, I kind of just get the impression that Alfred was certainly a formative physical mentor for Bruce just as much as he was emotionally at a young age after losing the Waynes. Particularly as a reaction to him, like, not knowing how to deal with this angsty Bruce Wayne, fresh after losing his parents. Because he talks about, in that scene, he's like, you needed a father. And I can't help but feel like it keys us into this idea that Alfred felt so awkward in that moment that all he could do was teach Bruce how to beat his problems away, and he might regret that a little bit, but it's formed Bruce into, even at that point, a piece of basically Gotham's mythological history.
Some of the visuals, it was like in the end with the flare, and him leading people through the water there, and then the camera image from the top with all the lights. It was just like, for me, it was like a bat. It was like a flock of bats coming out of a cave into the light, and I was just like, "Oh my goodness!"
There's a lot to like about that moment visually, and the beautiful thing is it's so silent, and it so relies on camera and acting and the physical blocking and staging. It's that moment where Bruce realizes that, and it all starts with him. After he dives into the water and he saves the mayor-elect and the son of the former mayor who was murdered at the beginning of the film, when he realizes that, like, he needs to get them out of there, and he kind of offers his hand into the darkness. And to me, it was that moment where Bruce realized he can't punch into the darkness. He has to be the hand to lead people out.
Juxtaposed the beginning of the film is in the beginning of the film, he comes out of the dark, reveals himself as Vengeance, and the very person he's trying to save is scared to death of him and is like, please don't hurt me. It's like totally missed it.
Yeah.
And it's like, so he comes out of the dark only to scare the very people he's trying to save, and then in the end he's reaching into the dark, and it's the hand of a child that grabs his hand, and he leads everyone out. It's like, for me, the juxtaposition of his journey of where he started in the movie to where he got to, it was like a really good visual for me of that kind of spiritual and emotional journey that he took throughout the film.
Yeah, there's a fleshed out character arc there for this Bruce Wayne, and that's what I think is exciting. I think a lot of hardcore comic book fans that come into a Batman movie and they expect him to be fully formed, and myself as a comic book fan, as a storyteller, I'm totally uninterested in that. I want a Batman, it's particularly because this is the first movie in what might be a trilogy. I want a Batman who has a lot to learn, because if Batman's fully formed, like, what's gonna challenge him emotionally, mentally, physically? I want a Batman who I believe is going to be challenged. In this movie, Batman got hurt. He took punches. He made mistakes. And yes, he's formidable. He's and I'm going to quote Frank Miller, he's the goddamn Batman. But he's not perfect, and he's still figuring things out, and he's still figuring himself out, as evident by the fact that he's deprived Bruce Wayne of all the oxygen in the room in order to feed it into the Batman, you know? And yeah, I mean, just being able to watch that change for this character, again, realizing that fear has its place, but that cannot be the sort of totem of his crusade on crime. His crusade on crime needs to be preventing people from, you know, being in that situation in the first place, as opposed to punishing the people that are. And again, pulling people out of the darkness as opposed to blindly throwing fists into it. And you know, and that's where that again is juxtaposed by the version of Something in the Way by Nirvana, which is kind of lifted by the orchestra as Batman pulls people, you know, out of Gotham Square Garden, you know, the flooded Gotham Square Garden, into the daylight. Like, this is the first time we're seeing Batman stay out at sunrise, because he's no longer this creature of the night. He is a symbol of hope that pulls people out of the darkness. And that was beautiful. Like, you know, it in a way that, and that executed in a way that the Christopher Nolan movies never did, because I always felt like the Christopher Nolan movies, despite how good they were generally, we were always being spoon-fed theme. We're always being told something about chaos. We're always being told that Bruce Wayne has to be something more. We were always being told that Bruce Wayne, you know, needed to learn how to pick himself up when he fell. But this movie showed us that Bruce Wayne not only had to pick himself up when he fell, but it's his responsibility to pick the people up that he's claiming that he wants to save. That he has to be the one to pull his city out of the darkness, as opposed to jumping in and becoming part of it.
Oh yeah, it's just so many things they did right. So many things. I mean, we could probably talk for hours on just like just pick a theme, and they did it right.
The one of the things too that nobody's talking about, that I am just obsessed with, was the way they played with a cinematic concept called tilt shift focus, particularly when Batman is investigating a crime scene. So the premise of tilt shift focus is when you have a particular object or a person whose behavior is totally clear, and everything else on camera is sort of obscured by like a Gaussian blur. And Bruce Wayne during crime scenes is particularly interesting to watch, and particularly interesting to see how he's interacting with everything around him, because you can see how hyper-fixated Bruce Wayne is on the investigation. Like, if you look at that not the opening scene, but when he's investigating the death of Mayor Mitchell, you see him sort of interact with the GCPD in the hallway as he makes that sort of long, awkward march to the crime scene. And like, in the middle of one of the officers talking to him, everything around him blurs except for the figure of Batman himself, and you can see immediately he's begun to narrow his focus down on the investigation and not care that Officer Martinez is made uncomfortable by Bruce being here. And it becomes solely about the case. And even when once he finally makes his way to the crime scene, there are very particular elements visually on screen that actually become clarified amongst all the blur, and you can kind of follow Batman as he begins to piece things together, which I, as a detective film, I really appreciate. But I think it also really illustrates the just like how fine-tuned of a mind Bruce Wayne has, and it's a very small thing that I think just contributes to his characterization really well.
Well, see, and you mentioned part of the whole he's not fully formed, he makes mistakes, is, you know, this is the first Batman movie I've seen where they explore him as the detective. But even then, he made mistakes. He didn't always have it figured out. I mean, he did better than just about everybody else in the room. But now that does lead me, though, to the Riddler. I keep changing my mind on how I perceive the conversation with the Riddler at the end of the movie. My first inclination is like, oh my goodness, he's got this figured out. He knows who Batman is. And he's like, Bruce Wayne. He just keeps saying Bruce Wayne. And it's like, you know, you see Batman start looking at the cameras, and he's starting to figure stuff out. Like, what am I going to do? Am I going to let this all come crashing down, or am I going to take the cameras and take this dude out and like make sure no one can, you know, reveal me? And then he you know, you let a man talk long enough, they tell on themselves, and he's like, yeah, we didn't get him. And then you know, Bruce Wayne realizes, oh, he doesn't know that I'm Batman.
Mm-hmm.
But then I go back and I'm like, or is that just Riddler effing with this dude and he really does know, it just isn't opportune to let him know? I don't know how to interpret that scene.
I get the impression that because he's under the impression that him and Batman are working together, right? That Batman is kind of holding this public figure, but that basically he's under the impression that him and Batman want the same thing, right? They want to uncover the sort of darkness, beneath the surface of Gotham. And I'm under the impression that he actually has that moment where he's spazzing out and he's talking about Bruce Wayne because I think he's trying to convince Batman to go kill Bruce Wayne in the Calamity.
Okay, see, there you go.
He's saying, he's saying Bruce Wayne, and because I think that there is a genuine like detestation that he has for Bruce, and there's also like throughout the film there are a lot of moments where they're making very direct comparisons between Bruce and the Riddler. Like even at the beginning, at the way beginning of the film, when the Riddler is watching Mayor Mitchell, the way he's spying on him is very similar to the way Bruce did so with Selina. Even if you notice the binoculars that they were using were the exact same. Like the I don't know what it's called, I don't have the experience, but like the view that they had, like even like down to like the little markers that were inside of the binoculars, completely the same. So this was a moment for me where again, it all kind of culminates in us learning about him being a former orphan and at this sort of mercy of the Waynes, essentially, in their charity. I don't think he knew that Bruce was Batman. I think that he was trying to kind of nonchalantly get Batman to go murder Bruce Wayne during the Calamity, so that he could actually finalize his plans. And by the way, that was seeded really well because up until that moment, because of the package being sent to the manor and everything, you're kind of and obviously something being addressed to Batman, like you're kind of convinced that he does know.
I was seriously convinced because like when Batman was looking on the walls inside the Riddler's house, I'm like, oh, he's looking at these clues and he's reading the clues as if the Riddler has figured out who he is. And
I mean, there were a couple of moments. There's also that moment where the Riddler is staring down at Bruce Wayne at Mayor Mitchell's funeral. When you're like, oh, is he staring at Bruce Wayne because he's waiting for Bruce Wayne to expose himself as Batman? But then, the more you think, like, this movie makes you second guess yourself, which is what I think is a telltale sign of a good noir film. Because there's also like the fact of the matter that, well, if he knew Bruce Wayne was Batman, why did he address that fireproof letter to Batman when he sent the package, right? Because that letter was meant to survive the explosion and Batman was meant to find it. So it all does sort of add up once you look at the big picture. And this Riddler, the scary thing about this Riddler is that he could be any one of us. Like, that's the frightening thing. He is a pure intellect. He looked normal. Like, you see him in the diner, and when he turns around with his hands up, like, that could be me. It could be you. Could be somebody watching. And then, obviously, things change once Paul Dano kind of begins to lay on this character's obsession a little bit, which is absolutely menacing, by the way. Like, I mean, I still think Heath Ledger might take the cake for like the greatest villain performance ever, but Paul Dano is a damn close second, man, because the way that he kind of controls the tone of this character is expertly done. I mean, there are almost moments where he doesn't have the mask, where he's probably more frightening than when he does.
So, your thoughts on the little tease of the Joker at the end? If I'm going to have one other nitpick on the film, I didn't hate it, but I could have done without it. I don't feel like it was necessary to tease the Joker.
It felt like an end credit scene.
Yeah.
Like it felt like that should have been the end credit scene as opposed to the little goodbye. I mean, I have this weird inclination that like maybe it was meant to be an end credit scene, and then Matt Reeves was like, well, this movie's already so long, like who's going to stay during the credits? Lo and behold, I don't think he realizes the impact of the Marvel generation, because we all stayed during the end credits.
I did.
I don't think we needed it during the main meat of the movie, and ironically, from what I understand, they actually edited out a scene of the film where Batman interacts with the Joker.
Very much like a Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter thing. Like, he's going to ask Joker about like, hey, help me solve this.
Well, yeah, and it was almost, from what I understand, that scene is reminiscent of their initial interaction in The Killing Joke. But what I do appreciate about it is that it tells me that, like, the Joker's, like, he exists. Like, he's already, the Batman has already taken him down once. So it makes me feel like this world is so much more fleshed out than, like, the film does a good job at making us hyper focus on the Riddler the whole time, and it almost kind of implies that this is Batman's first big rogue, but he's been doing this for 2 years now. And it would make sense that he's kind of conquered a couple of these big baddies. And the fact that, we've already gotten the Joker kind of excites me, because I don't think it's necessarily a promise that we're going to get Joker in the next movie. I think it just tells us, like, the rogues gallery is here, and, Joker's in prison, which means obviously he could very well break out, but to me it says, okay, this is meant to tell you that this world is established. This Joker does exist. I mean, they're going to use him at some point, because the Batman and Joker is basically just a license for them to print money. But it also tells me, hey, this next movie, like, maybe while the Joker and Riddler are figuring something out for some crazy third movie climax, maybe we get our Mr. Freeze story that Matt Reeves keeps talking about. Maybe we get a Two-Face story. I don't know. But I think there is a significance in kind of just establishing that, hey, like, we don't need to make a huge deal out of the Joker existing in this movie or the introduction of the Joker, I think that's part of the strength of this movie, having accumulated just complete raw talent as opposed to superstardom. The only one of these actors that have had any real crazy blockbuster success was Robert Pattinson, and that was like 10 years ago. And I think that's kind of to this movie's strength, as opposed to watching Batman v Superman and being like, that's Ben Affleck. This movie, like, you have these stupendously talented actors, and that's not to be said that Ben Affleck isn't talented, because he's one of the most underrated people in Hollywood right now as an actor, as director, but that's another conversation. But these characters and these actors are really able to sink into these roles, and they clearly have the chops to deliver on that.
I mean, Catwoman, I like how they explored some of that romantic tension between the two of them, because that to me as a child was very much there in the old blue silk pajama Batman on the TV series in the 80s. There was always this tension of Batman and Catwoman, like, they should be in a relationship, but maybe they shouldn't, but maybe they should, but they shouldn't, but we want them to.
Perhaps we might get to know each other a little better.
I would think that we know each other well enough by now.
Don't run away, Batman.
There's something just to be said about the general chemistry in this movie between the cast, and Bruce and Selina's was really special, particularly because I think also, like, Zoe Kravitz delivers a really nuanced Catwoman in a way that very much gives Michelle Pfeiffer a run for her money as, like, the queen of that role.
You got a lot of cats.
Never think about strays.
I mean, and don't get me wrong, they're very different portrayals. Michelle Pfeiffer's is hyper stylized, but this Selina just feels like a real character in a way that, like, Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman kind of didn't. It felt like an extreme.
It did.
And they were meant to. Like, you look at those Anton Furst set designs, and that world is just meant to be something entirely different and exaggerated. But this Selina, felt so real and so emotional, and watching the sort of chemistry between her and Batman build throughout the course of the film, and a lot of it is silent. Their admiration becomes sort of boiled down to the way they look at each other. They're very rarely, up until the end of the movie, do you see them verbally expressing, their affection in any way whatsoever for one another. But it's the way that they carry themselves and the way that they perform physically that really kind of drives that emotional tension, and in a really good way, right? Like, they could have blown their load really early in that movie, in ways that I think you could argue that Burton did in Batman Returns, but or even that what's his name, Chris Nolan might have done in The Dark Knight Rises. But it kind of builds this very silent appreciation for one another, and unlike Nolan, again, he doesn't spoon feed you why these characters like each other. Like, there's no explicit scene where Batman's like, "I love your free spirit," and Selina's like, "I love your sense of honor." Like, you can tell that Selina recognizes that like Batman is probably the one male figure ever in her life that has ever tried to do anything right for her, for people like her, for that city. And Bruce kind of recognizes that really damaged part of Selina that is all too similar to himself, and recognizes elements of himself that could have been in her. And that's, how they connect. And they both sort of realize that, either person is even better and even greater of a human being than they probably thought based on their own trauma. And then again, you go into the Jeffrey Wright dynamic, and I mean, he's just so pleasant. Like he's just such a good balance to Batman's like hyper focused, unapologetic approach to solving crimes. And they do it without making Jeffrey Wright look incompetent, because I think it would have been really easy, to kind of sacrifice the implied competence of Jim Gordon in order for him to be that sort of figure of levity for Batman.
We see in this one, there's an established relationship with Gordon and Batman, and they have trust for each other, and trust enough that they could even rib at each other. Like Batman ribbing like, well, you are a cop. And then, Gordon like, well, yeah, I still don't know your name, and, but they still trust each other. So it's like, they're good enough friends that they can pick at each other without that formality, but there's still that, I got very much the sense that the reason that Gordon doesn't know who Batman is it's more or less that Batman ain't gonna tell nobody. Like, dude, I'm protecting you.
Well, that again, and I think there's a part of him that doesn't quite care as much as he lets on. I mean, he clearly had the opportunity when Bruce was, kind of captive in the GCPD after being knocked unconscious, and he's the one guy defending him. So much so that he, you have that really great interaction where he's trying so hard to make it look like he's getting up in Batman's face.
What do you think, Kinsey Moon Knights for the Penguin?
But he's basically trying to use that as an outlet to communicate information, and eventually being like, "Hey, hit me! Like, get out of here."
I'm Moonlight's just a car.
And there's just like a great silent chemistry between them, that isn't always super explicit. That I think is just another reason to laud the visual storytelling of the film, because it's just in the way that these characters carry themselves that you believe that they trust one another, that you believe that Bruce is able to sort of let that guard down a little bit around him, and that Gordon, despite not knowing anything about this guy, understands his intentions and understands that they are pure. So much so that, again, like at the end of the film, towards the end of the film, when Bruce takes that substance, which I'll say, I think it's venom. I thought it was venom from the jump.
Yes, thank you for that.
Particularly with how he. So I'll get into that spiel in a minute. But the way Gordon like tries to stop him from making a mistake, like Batman almost beats a guy to death after taking that stuff, and that could have been venom. It could have been epinephrine. I don't know, but Gordon is just as much interested in the preservation of the spirit of Batman as he is in uplifting Gotham, right, and in saving Gotham, because he knows ultimately that that aiming Batman at Gotham is going to be the most effective way at bringing it out of the darkness. But going into that scene, I remember seeing that moment. I was like, that's like, that bright green is the brightest thing we've seen in this movie the whole time. There's no way Matt Reeves doesn't want me to pay attention to it.
My first thing was I immediately went to the whole, like with, who was it? George Clooney. I was thinking Batman and Robin with Venom and Poison Ivy, and I'm like, that is exactly what that is. And I'm not a comics guy. It's a movie guy, and immediately I'm thinking in the video game when I played the whole Injustice thing, I'm like, that's Venom.
Well, so at first, when like this movie, because it's so grounded, I was like, it's probably just epinephrine. Like, it would make sense for Batman to carry a vial of epinephrine to produce adrenaline, in dire situations. But then, you begin to really pay attention to his mannerisms and that complete and utter like bestiality to him once he takes it, and obviously the color, is a clue. It's like, that's got to be Venom. And once we get that scene towards the end of the movie where they introduce Barry Keoghan as Joker, I'm like, that's definitely fucking Venom. Like, they're opening the sandbox here, like 100%. Yeah, no, that's exciting. And who knows? I mean, that's the cool thing about this, right? We could never ever get Bane like as a major villain. But you know what? If that is Venom, it again is just another small nod to making this world feel established, right? Like it already tells you that Batman's probably taken down Bane. Batman has obviously understood the functional purpose of Venom. I have a take, right? I have a hot, well, not a hot take. I have a prediction that I think would make a lot of sense given where this movie ends off, because spoilers for the end of the movie. It basically turns into Batman No Man's Land, where Gotham gets cut off from the world, and then it's declared a state of emergency, and it becomes this place of absolute chaos, right? Whereas before there was a light at the end of the tunnel, there is no light. There's no tunnel because it's been blown out. Here's where I think this arc goes. Batman, now having come out of his sort of spire of vengeance, his new what's the word I'm looking for? Philosophy is sort of put to the test, right? Like a Gotham that almost seems unsavable, a Gotham at its absolute worst, that really challenges Bruce's new mentality about not punching into the darkness and rather being the hand. But what happens when, you put you what's the word I'm looking for? Present your hand into the darkness and everything is so heavy that it tries pulling you back under. So I think that Bruce, perhaps, again, me pulling in some comic book references, gets overwhelmed by this no man's land. No allies. There's no Catwoman. Everybody is sort of overworked. The resources are not there. That perhaps he becomes a little bit too reliant on the Venom in no man's land in order to just function, in order to continue being Batman in this desolate Gotham. And maybe they pull in elements from the Batman Venom storyline where he becomes addicted to it as basically a strength enhancing drug. And really the arc of this next film is Bruce, one, learning how to pull himself out from the darkness before he can pull anybody else out, and realizing that, that's the only way Batman can lift up Gotham is if he has his own 2 feet to stand on. So I think that'd be really interesting, because then, like, in the way that the Batman really kind of pulls inspiration from several classic Batman stories, I mean, it just makes sense to kind of combine the internal and physical conflicts of Batman Venom and Batman No Man's Land. And I think it makes a lot of sense for the potential trajectory of this character's story arc.
One tiny little thing that I appreciated in this one that just speaks to the attention to small detail, because you're talking about it couldn't have been on accident that was like the brightest color we got. I remember in Batman Returns with Michael Keaton when he rips his mask off. We all know that in order for your face to look dark in these cowls, that you got to put makeup on. And then when he rips his mask off, there's no freaking makeup. And it's like, I don't care about movie magic. You just took me out of it. You ruined the ability to suspend my disbelief and immerse me in the world. And very much, it's like, no movie magic. If he's going to be wearing a mask and his eyes are all blacked out and he takes his mask off, he's going to have a crap ton of black makeup on. And we saw that. Right. And it's a tiny little thing, but I so appreciated it.
I think that really adds to, like, the comments that I made earlier about this movie just spending time to be immersive. And it does it well in very small ways, in the way that, like I said, we get to watch Selina spend a little bit of extra time and care to crack open that safe without leaving any real impression that it's been opened, or Bruce retaining the black makeup on when he takes off the cowl, or even the way that again, like, Bruce Wayne just stares at Mayor Mitchell's son, after basically walking in on his father's death. Like, there are a lot of little things that really immerse you into the film.
And Alfred staring at the recording of Batman staring. Yes. I'm just like, this whole, it's like, in that moment, it's like Alfred gets to stand behind the cowl and see what Bruce is seeing, and if anyone gets it, it's him.
Well, even more so, it's literally like walking a day in his shoes, right? I mean, he goes from scolding Bruce Wayne, or scolding Batman, for neglecting Bruce Wayne, to then seeing through the eyes of Bruce Wayne as Batman and understanding, like, that he needs this and Gotham needs this, and that ultimately, despite his worry, right, for his surrogate son, this needs to happen, because the only person that is going to, without being like too corny, the only person that is going to stare that kid down and give him the time of day and make a better Gotham for that little boy is going to be Bruce Wayne, who went through that same exact trauma as a little boy. There's like this sad realization that Alfred has in that moment where he's literally seeing through Bruce's eyes, and he's like, he's so conflicted because obviously he doesn't want his son to kind of donate himself absolutely to this cause, but he also realizes that it's almost necessary. And it's almost like in order to help Bruce become Batman, he has to sacrifice his son. And it's tragic. It's really tragic and beautiful.
I've never experienced an execution of a film like, I think that's what it comes down to is the amount of time and thought that was taken to say, I'm going to produce a film and I'm going to pay attention to the small things as well as the big things, and I'm not going to spoon feed you what you should feel and think, but I'm going to let you soak in it. I'm going to let you feel, because there's so many people I've talked to that have their own interpretation of the way they've seen things, and some of them are very different, some of them are very similar, and it's like, and I think every single one of them are valid, because it's like you have to sit in that, and you get to see you get to see the Riddler's point of view, you get to see Bruce's point of view, because it's like every time you think you're going to have this moment of intimacy where Bruce gets where Bruce gets to reconcile Bruce and the Bat together, like you have a moment where it's like, I think he's going to let Catwoman know who he is, and then she immediately attacks the person of Bruce Wayne to Batman, and it's like, nope, not going to happen. Bruce and Batman, two different people. And it's like every opportunity he gets to reconcile those two, it's like, no, you do not get that luxury in this world. That does not happen.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce is effectively the sacrifice, for Batman. And I think that is likely part of what's going to be a lesson for him moving into this next film, right? Like if we do get that no man's land Batman sort of deprived of resources and in this sort of gang war Gotham City, I think that it makes sense for this to be the film for him to begin to recognize that in order for Batman to be pure of heart, there needs to be Bruce Wayne weighing him down. There needs to be that human element that is beneath the mythology, that keeps it in check, and that prevents Batman from forgetting why he's doing it in the first place. You begin to see glimmers of that by the end of this film, but I think it's going to become a lot more present in the next one, or at least to me, narratively, it would make a lot of sense.
And I have to give one final call out before we wrap this out. I'm a car guy. I manage an automotive repair chain, and
yeah,
that Batmobile. When he turned that motor on, it scared me. Like I felt like one of the bad guys. Like I felt this visceral fear. Like this machine is alive and it is going to eat me. And there's an evil guy behind the wheel coming for me. It's time to run. And it's just like,
yeah.
And that for the character, he had to intentionally build it that way to create the effect. And I was just like, well executed.
Your entire chase scene was practical.
Yes, I did.
Which is incredible. Like Matt Reeves has been talking, like that's phenomenal. That might be the best like Batmobile chase scene we've gotten ever. Strictly because not only was it cool in and of itself, and there were some really cool like sort of intrusive shots in that scene. The fact that there was like little to no CGI in there is incredible.
Masterfully done. And that's what I felt like it is. I'm not trying to overhype it, but when I say it's a masterpiece, for me, at least it is. It's like I can appreciate art, I can appreciate storytelling devices, I can appreciate good acting, I can appreciate attention to little details, and throughout all my life of movies that I've watched, especially movies that I've watched again and again and again and again, I don't think any movie has ever executed all of those different things simultaneously. This one, for me, pulled it off, and maybe I'm suffering from what people call the Marvel effect. I'm gonna have to go back and watch it again, but I don't think I am, because I did go into this with a very critical eye, wanting to not like things. I really was. I was wanting to not like things because I was like, we've had enough. It's kind of like Spider-Man. We've had enough daggum Batman movies and Spider-Man movies. You either execute this well, or you're gonna fall on your face, and there's no mercy from the fans.
No, and I mean, and this just turned out to be an excellent film. You know, like and it stands on its own. Like, I mean, compared to this movie, Spider-Man: No Way Home is a pile of dog shit. I make no qualms about it. Like, this is just narratively a bulletproof film, and it stands on its own, right? Like, obviously, the Batman mythology really enriches the film, and they put the Batman mythology to good use as this skin. But and there are obviously thematic elements that are very core to Batman, but this genre film also stands entirely on its own. You know, this could be a brand new character that we're experiencing this world through, and it would still be a great film. Whereas, like, the entire existence of Spider-Man: No Way Home was to make jokes and references to 15-year-old Spider-Man movies.
Oh yeah, and
which, like,
I think,
ironically, you didn't need to have seen the two Sony Disney collaborative Spider-Man movies because they do enough flashbacks. But that's another conversation. It's a great movie. Like, I think it's the greatest comic book film of all time. And that's a hard stance, because in a way that Logan amazed me, this one took it to the next level in where it is just so, it is so loving to the source material and so loving of everything that noir filmmaking and that, you know, that the psychological thriller genre has to offer, and it just marries them. It marries them super well. The key, I think, to this movie is just integration. Everything just integrated so well with one another, and
I don't think there was any waste of space. It was like,
no, and it's a 3-hour movie. Like,
it was like, if something is going to be in this movie, it is to have a purpose, like, period.
Right.
I mean, it's like the whole green hotel sign that literally gives us away the entire plot in the beginning of the movie, and we all miss it. The green hotel sign, right above it is the Riddler spying on the club. I mean, he's there for us to see, and we miss it. And he even gives us the green color for the Riddler, and we miss it. But it's like nothing in that film. It's like, I feel like I'd love to see what it was before he pared it down to 3 hours. But it's like, I felt like he sat there and was like, no, that's unnecessary. Get rid of it. If it doesn't tie into this, and this, and all weave in and mesh together, then we're not using it.
In a lesser director, you get like Zack Snyder, right? Where, like, his artistic vision in 4:3 has to be 4 hours, but it's actually like hour and a half of movie, 2.5 hours of garbage. And you have a competent filmmaker like Matt Reeves, who is just like under a lesser director, a 3-hour movie would have felt way too long. Cough, Zack Snyder.
Yeah, well, it's like Zack Snyder. Every time we got Wonder Woman come on the scene, we get the whole lamenting wail. And I'm like, oh, really? Are we going here again? I can't hear that lamenting wail.
But I mean, you know, like, this 3-hour movie could have very well felt overbearing. And the great thing about Matt Reeves as a director, as the co-screenwriter of the film, is that, like, it needs every minute of those 3 hours, and it was given just the right amount of time that it needed to allow everything to breathe, to be able to develop the characters and the plot and the world, and the sort of ambiance, you know, of every scene and every space. And again, to really work on how all of those things are going to be interacting and interconnecting with one another. It is, I think, the perfect marriage of comic book film and genre film, and they just deliver in so many ways that I don't think anybody ever expected them to, and I'm so glad they did. So much so that I have a 12-inch Robert Pattinson Batman statue on the way, and I don't ever buy statues.
Nice. Well, Trevor, this has been a pleasure, my friend. I'm going to maybe edit this down. You know, I don't think I am. I'm just going to go back and maybe do a couple digital things. But this has been an awesome conversation with you. Like, I couldn't think of anybody I'd rather discuss it with me. I'm glad you had me read. I did read Batman year one. It was the first year of Batman. I read that. I hadn't got into year 2 yet when I went to go see this. So I had those little appreciative, like, okay, I see what's happening here.
Yeah, tell me you didn't think about, especially knowing that you got through year 1, like, how do you, in that moment where you're watching Robert Pattinson kind of make his way amongst the crowd in Gotham, and he's talking about the sort of state of the city, how do you not think about the moment in year 1 where he comes back home and he's talking about how he needs to be something greater in order to combat the city that he left? And like, it reminded me of the moment where Bruce Wayne, he's like, he goes out into the slums of the city wearing like a hat and a bomber jacket, it's just this beautiful, beautiful callback to that story, and even the tone, despite the fact that they actually didn't pull any of the internal monologue specifically from year one. It very much evokes all of the elements that it did in the original comic, while being completely unique.
Well, yeah, because
to this cinematic
I had to go back and
version.
read it because I was like, is he pulling this from the actual comic book? Because I was convinced he was, and then I got back home and I'm like, okay, no, he didn't. But I had that vibe very much, very much. Thank you for giving me your time because I know you're an hour ahead of me. And again, congrats on the Kickstarter. I can't wait for 5. It's just gonna get better. I can't wait to read 4. I haven't read 4, let alone 5. But it's been a pleasure getting to know you. It's been a pleasure getting to share what we love together from different perspectives. And please tell me Matt Reeves is making another one of these. Please.
I hope so, man. Hey, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for chatting with me, for having me on. And for sharing your perspective. I always like getting, different angles of experiencing art. I think that's the cool thing about art, is that everybody's going to have something different to take away from it, and we can sort of connect on mutual understanding and begin to redefine how we look at it based on other perspectives. So that's super cool, and that's it's part of what makes this conversation so interesting. Like you have the perspective of a long time film fan and somebody who is both a comic book fan and a rising storyteller. So you get very different sides, right, of what's being communicated by the film, and what is kind of being impressed upon us as the audience, right? Because despite having these perspectives, we're both members of this audience. So I think that's super great. And thank you for supporting the book so thoroughly. Thank you to Christian and Mark and Jason and John, and man, it's incredible. I look forward to moving onward and upward, and God willing, hopefully sometime in the future I get to leave my own mark on the Batman.
Heck yeah, brother.
Do my own thing.
Well, Mark McKeever, thank you for introducing me to this guy. This has been an amazing journey. Much more to come. Brother man, you take care. Y'all out there in movie land and YouTube land, stay nerdy with it, because I'm a nerd. Trevor's a nerd. We're all nerds. But you take care, brother man. Thank you. Well, there you have it, folks. That for me was a wonderful, fun interview with a good buddy of mine, Trevor, who I've really only got to talk to a couple times, but it's like I feel like we're a kindred spirit. We appreciate the same things from very different backgrounds, very different perspectives. I think the coolest thing about Trevor is actually what you don't see in the edit between the transition of the end of the interview to now is the extra hour of conversation that I got to have with Trevor. Same thing happened with our interview last time. But I don't know. It's not often that you find somebody that you can just click with on certain things. And when this guy blows up, I know him. I got to know him. So there you have it, folks. I appreciate you if you stuck with us this long. 2 nerdy guys talking about the Batman. And I know it's not for everybody. Not everybody loved it. But I think people can appreciate that this was a well thought out, well executed movie, even if you don't think it's the most amazing movie of all time. I'm convinced it's a masterpiece for me. So stay nerdy with it. We'll see you next time.